Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a really high-stakes piece of geopolitical communication. It's excerpts from Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif's address at the 80th UN General Assembly session.
Yeah, and this source material, it's dense, it's very emotional, packed with some pretty critical claims. It really lays out Pakistan's perspective on, well, everything. Global affairs, regional conflicts, humanitarian issues, economic justice.
And there's a core message sort of tying it all together.
Exactly. It's this belief that, and I'm quoting here, multilateralism is no more an option, it is a need of the art. That phrase kind of echoes throughout.
Right. In the opening, it sets a pretty tense scene for this deep dive. We're told straight away the world's complex, conflicts are heating up, international laws being ignored, and maybe most crucially, climate change is threatening survival, especially for places like Pakistan.
Yeah. So our mission today is really to understand how Pakistan is framing all these huge challenges, both internal and external, on that global stage at the UN.
Okay, let's start with maybe the most dramatic part. These claims about regional conflict. The sources use really strong language right off the bat, unprovoked aggression from the East. What did the address actually say happened back in May?
Well, the sources lay out a very specific and, politically charged story. Pakistan claimed it was hit first, unprovoked aggression in May. They accused India of turning down an offer for an international investigation into something called the Pahalgam incident.
Okay.
They painted it as India trying to, quote, extract political gains from a human tragedy. And instead of investigating, the claim is India attacked our cities and targeted our innocent civilians.
Wow, that's a serious charge to make at the UN.
Yeah.
So when they talked about their military response, was it just about saying we had the right to defend ourselves?
It was framed that way, yeah. Self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, definitely. But the level of detail they went into, it goes beyond just a justification, It feels like a strong signal of national capability, of resolve.
How so?
They specifically mentioned military achievements, praising leaders like Field Marshal Syed Asim Munir for stunning professionalism. And there was this really specific, very assertive claim about air power under Air Chief Marshal Zahir Babar Sidhu. They claimed their forces turned, quote, 7 of the Indian jets to scrap and dust.
7 jets. That's incredibly specific.
Exactly. It's presented not just as defense, but as a, quote, decisive response to the aggressor. So the underlying message seems to be, peace comes after strength is recognized.
Okay. And that focus on strength makes the next part, the diplomacy bit, even more interesting, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because this is where President Donald Trump comes into the picture, quite heavily credited in the sources. He's portrayed as the one who helped end this confrontation. What do they say about his role?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's like a nod to, well, transactional diplomacy. The sources say Pakistan agreed to a ceasefire, but crucially from a position of strength. And this ceasefire was facilitated by what they called President Trump's bold and visionary leadership.
Bold and visionary leadership.
Yes. The speech explicitly credits his efforts, saying he helped avert a more threatening war in South Asia.
Which then leads straight to nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize. That's quite a gesture. Why highlight that in a UN address? Is it just symbolic praise, or is there something more strategic going on?
Oh, I think it's highly strategic. The source says nominating him was, quote, the least we could do for his love for peace. But think about it strategically. Publicly nominating a major global figure like Trump, especially one known for trying mediation.
Right.
It does 2 things, right? First, it acknowledges and sort of banks the diplomatic win from the recent mediation. And second, it's almost like an open invitation. It keeps him, or at least his political influence, potentially in the loop for future issues in the region. It keeps that channel open.
A calculated move then.
Seems like it. And that sets up the next pivot in the speech quite nicely. Having established this military strength, they then shift focus. Pakistan says it now wants to win peace. How? Through, quote, composite, comprehensive, and result-oriented dialogue with India on all outstanding issues.
Okay, so shifting from military claims to dialogue. That's a big diplomatic turn. But how do they square that desire for dialogue with these really stark warnings about the Indus Water Treaty, the IWT?
Yeah, that's where the lines get drawn very, very clearly. Pakistan strongly condemned what it called India's unilateral and illegal attempt to basically suspend the Indus Water Treaty. They argued this defies the treaty itself and international law. And the IWT, well, it's fundamental for Pakistan's water security. Millions depend on it.
And the language they use around the IWT, It wasn't just legal, was it? It sounded almost like a military warning. What was that act of war threshold they mentioned?
Exactly. They didn't mince words. Pakistan explicitly stated that any violation of the Indus Treaty represents an act of war. Full stop. They said they will definitely and fully defend the water rights of their 24 million people.
It's huge.
It's probably one of the most significant statements in the whole address. It directly links a vital resource, water, to the absolute highest threshold of conflict. What you, the listener, need to grasp here is that this puts pressure on the UN, on everyone, to see resource disputes as potential triggers for major wars. They're demanding mediation before things get to that point.
And alongside the IWT, they also brought up the Kashmir issue again, didn't they?
Absolutely. That core position hasn't changed. Pakistan reassured the Kashmiri people of support, expressing hope that, quote, India's tyranny in Kashmir will come to a grinding halt. And the demand remains the same. Self-determination through an impartial plebiscite under the auspices of this very organization, meaning the UN.
So the message is water and territory. These issues need solving together for any real peace.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Okay, let's shift gears now, quite dramatically, from those regional disputes to a global humanitarian crisis. The sources dedicate significant time to the situation in Palestine, calling it a stain on a global conscience.
Yeah, the language here is incredibly strong, very evocative, uncompromising, really. The sources talk about Israel's brutal occupation and the genocidal onslaught in Gaza, phrases like unspeakable terror upon women and children. The pace of the speech, you can tell from the source, really slows down here to focus on the human cost.
And this is where it gets incredibly personal, almost unforgettable. There's a specific, heartbreaking story used to make the point, isn't there?
Yes, the story of Hind Rajab. The speaker mentions her by name, calls her a child, a little baby, and recalls hearing her trembling voice on that phone call. And then comes this powerful claim in the source material. The world collectively failed Hind Rajab.
Wow.
It's a deliberate move, you see, linking the big abstract idea of international law failing to one specific vulnerable child. It maximizes the emotional punch, the diplomatic weight.
And to make that connection even stronger, the speaker shared something deeply personal.
That's right. A very powerful moment. The speaker shared the experience of carrying the tiny coffin of a 6-year-old Urtiza Abbas during the recent conflict with India, drawing that direct line from personal grief over a child lost in their own conflict to the children of Gaza. It hammers home this sense of shared agony, and that leads right into the policy demands. Immediate ceasefire, support for a sovereign Palestinian state, pre-1967 borders, Al-Quds Sharif as the capital.
And perhaps surprisingly, President Trump gets another mention here.
Yeah.
In relation to the Middle East.
Yes, it shows how wide Pakistan is casting its diplomatic net, perhaps. The speech expresses gratitude to President Trump for what's called a time initiative. Just 3 days earlier, an invitation for Arab Islamic states to meet at the UN for consultations. This was framed as something that had rekindled hope for a ceasefire, again looking towards external leadership to help break logjams.
Okay, so from international conflict and diplomacy, the speech then moves pretty seamlessly into the global fight against terrorism. Pakistan positions itself here as having made huge sacrifices for the world.
Right.
What kind of numbers did they use?
The numbers cited are quite stark. Pakistan says it's been on the counterterrorism front line for over 20 years. Over 90,000 lives lost. An economic hit of $150 billion. The source claims these are probably the biggest sacrifices made by any country globally. It positions Pakistan as, well, a vital security partner for everyone else.
And they used that global village idea to frame their fight.
They did. The speech really stressed that terrorism has to be fought everywhere. There's a powerful quote. A man killed in New York is a man killed in Lahore. A man killed in Islamabad is a man killed in London. It shifts the focus from just a local problem to a shared global security threat. And that, of course, helps justify calls for international support for their counterterrorism efforts.
They also claim they are victims of terrorism sponsored from outside. Which groups or forces did they actually name?
Yes, this is where it gets quite specific and complex, involving local actors. They named the TTP, the Tehrik-Taliban Pakistan, also the BLA, the Baluchistan Liberation Army. And they use some highly charged terms like Fitnal Khawarij and Fitnal Hindustan, which imply sort of seditious or foreign-backed troublemakers.
Okay, groups like the BLA, what's their typical target?
Right. The BLA, for example, often goes after big infrastructure projects, particularly those connected to CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And the claim was that all these groups were operating from Afghan soil. They highlighted the severity by mentioning a specific incident, the dastardly Jaffa Express train incident from earlier that year where hundreds were held hostage.
So given that claim about Afghan soil, what does Pakistan expect from the interim government in Afghanistan?
Well, as a direct neighbor, Pakistan obviously has a huge stake in a stable Afghanistan. They expect the interim government to meet international obligations like human rights, especially women's rights. But the number one demand really is ensuring Afghan soil is not used for terrorism against anyone, particularly Pakistan.
Let's pivot now to what feel like truly existential threats: climate change and economic stability. This seems to be where the theme of global injustice really comes through strongly in the source material. There was a shocking statistic about Pakistan's emissions versus the impact it suffers.
Yeah, the sense of injustice is almost tangible in the speech. Pakistan contributes, quote, less than 1% of global emissions annually. Tiny. And yet they face the relentless brunt of climate change. It's this extreme mismatch between who caused the problem and who's paying the price.
And the price isn't just abstract numbers, it's real devastation.
Absolutely. The floods in 2022 caused $34 billion in losses. That's enormous. The address mentioned that this year, 2025, they were hit by another mega flood. Thousands of villages gone, billions more lost. They had to declare a climate emergency.
And this leads into a major critique of the global financial system, the whole debt argument. The speaker sounded incredibly frustrated about the international response, didn't they?
Oh, deeply. This is really the core of their plea for global justice. The criticism is aimed right at the irony, the perceived hypocrisy of being told to just borrow loans and add on to our debt to recover from climate disasters they didn't create.
Right.
The speaker argued this is just a path to ruin, saying they'd be better off than not borrowing loan and standing on our own feet.
Huh.
So the key takeaway here is they're rejecting the standard way of funding climate recovery debt. They see it as compounding the injustice, almost like economic violence, on top of the ecological disaster.
So they're pushing for things like climate reparations or loss and damage funds to be grants, not more loans.
Exactly. Funds that don't trap developing nations in more debt.
Now, alongside pleading for financial justice, did they mention any domestic economic reforms to show they're also working on their own future?
Yes, briefly. The speech touched on domestic goals, pushing for deep structural reforms, modernizing the tax system, and interestingly, looking towards technology embracing digitization, AI, and crypto as the tools of the future. It signals they want to move the economy forward beyond just agriculture and industry.
And finally, they connected these domestic plans back to global governance, particularly partnerships.
That's right. They highlighted the strategic partnership with China through CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. There was strong praise for President Xi Jinping's Global Governance Initiative, seeing it as a potential framework for more just, fair, and inclusive development.
So maybe preferring development models that don't come with the same strings often attached by Western institutions.
That seems to be the suggestion. And they wrapped up that section by mentioning their own role on the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member. They pointed to the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2788 under Pakistan's presidency as proof of their commitment to multilateral action when it works.
So after diving into all of this, what does this incredibly complex address really mean for you, the listener? We've synthesized this narrative that swings from, really high-tension claims of military success to deep humanitarian pain focused on children like Hind Rajab, and then this profound sense of systemic injustice, especially around climate change and the burden of debt.
Yeah, I think it synthesizes a nation's commitment to multilateralism, definitely, but with a huge caveat. Only if that system actually changes, if it delivers real justice and development, not just crisis management. The overall message seems to be Pakistan wants dialogue, wants peace, but it won't shy away from defining its core interests: water, security, counterterrorism, in really strong, non-negotiable terms.
It's a staggering amount of ground to cover in one speech, presenting this unified vision to the world. But that brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. Considering how much emphasis the source material puts on the Indus Water Treaty, and that explicit warning violation is an act of war. Think about this. What specific practical tools does the UN system actually have? Or maybe tools outside the established courts and frameworks? Tools that could genuinely diffuse a conflict over something as vital as water between two nuclear-armed neighbors before it escalates to the military threshold Pakistan so clearly warned about. That feels like the real test for the kind of multilateralism they say is now a need of the art.